So let me talk about my confusion, because the topic I was given to speak on is philanthropy in India, understanding the landscape.
Yeah.
And on a topic of philanthropy, why are you calling a CSR wala like me to speak? I mean, it's chalk and cheese. And Amir gave a rather grand introduction of mine, but let me give you a more factual one. I work for a company called the Tata Group, and I work for the company. I don't work for the trust. I don't work for any foundation. I don't work for any trust. I work for something called Tata Sons Private Limited. And many of you know how the Tata Group is structured, but let me just specify that it's about 100 plus companies within the Tata Group. We don't know exactly. I mean, we don't specify the exact number because it depends on how you count. Are you including the wholly owned subsidiaries, or are you separating them out? Are you including them within the major company that it's owned by? Are you including the joint ventures? And therefore, you'll find that when Tata Group describes itself, it usually says 100 plus companies, and some of them are behemoths. Some of them are small and more like startups and so on, but it's about 100 plus. And the controlling interest is held by something called a holding company, which is called, in this case, is Tata Sons, where I work. Now, most conglomerates like ours, the holding company or the group center is a very powerful entity, because they decide, and sitting in the group center, you sort of pass an edict, and all the companies have to sort of adhere to that. Unfortunately, and very sadly for me, one finds that the Tata Group is not such a thing. That companies like Tata Steel and Tata Motors, which are huge global giants themselves, have very little interest in what somebody in Tata Sons has to say, especially somebody in middle management, in what we call the rabbit warrens of middle management, somebody like me. And one doesn't have the ability to pass orders and edicts and mandates and that sort of stuff. One has to get work done in a much more cooperative way. And that's the beauty, but also the difficulty in working in a position in Tata Sons, in my case. So the first point I want to make was I'm not in any foundation or trust or anything like that. I'm with the company, and I have a company's perspective on things, which is the business perspective, and not a charitable or a philanthropic or anything like that perspective. I'm very so Tata Sons itself is owned by mostly owned 66% by Tata Trusts. And that's because our founders structured us that way. That they decided that instead of giving their money to the next generation, their children and then their grandchildren after that, of whom 50% usually turn out to be nikammas, they said that instead of that, we'll put our shares into a trust, and the dividends of the companies across the group will go into the trusts. And the trust's sole purpose is to give back to India within the country. That's the only job. It doesn't have any other job. But I don't work for the trusts. I work for the company, for the group center, and mine is the corporate perspective and not the trust perspective. And therefore this confusion, because there's no such thing as philanthropy for us. Now, what do I do there? And that also has a bearing on this discussion, and that's why I want to go into it. That I have some non-operational responsibilities, and one of them is something called CSR. CSR, those of you who know a little about CSR will know that it's done by the companies. A group center doesn't really have a role, but we have a guiding and a strategic and sort of representing the group to the larger world and that sort of stuff, and that's what me and my team do. So CSR reports into me, but what we call CSR, and that is a very small part of our social responsibility. What we call CSR is a very Indian understanding of CSR, which is that you have to put in 2% of your profit before tax into a certain set of activity, which are almost anything, but not quite anything. And you have to spend it on societal good and so on. And that's what the Indian understanding of CSR is. But social responsibilities are much higher. And so I have some things that are also, which don't come out within the narrow understanding of CSR, but are also social responsibilities, such as, for example, disaster response. When a disaster strikes in the country, then the Tata Group usually does something about it. We don't like to write checks to other people and that sort of stuff. We prefer to do, something of our own, and that means our own volunteers going out, ourselves doing something about it. And we've done. I mean, the importance of a group center, somebody in the group center managing this responsibility, is that we can cut across the company level silos. Otherwise people from one company coordinating with people from another company and many companies working together. It's possible only because somebody from the group center is able to is actually managing it and has the power to financial provisions and that sort of stuff. So that also reports into me. I don't handle it myself now anymore, but it reports into me. And this is disaster response. It's quite significant in Tata. We've put in about in the past 5 years about 200 crore rupees into disaster response, and this is not our CSR funds or something like that. This is separate from CSR. Then something else that comes to me is volunteering. So I'm talking about our broader social responsibility at Tata, at the companies. We have CSR I talked about, which is the 2%. Then disaster response. Volunteering is something we say that, we have this great resource, which is 700,000 plus people. And these people should do something more than just their jobs and that sort of thing. And they should do something for society directly and not as part of money. They should give their expertise and time and so on. We put in total about 1.5 million hours of volunteering hours a year. It's one of the largest corporate volunteering programs in the world. I wish I could show off a lot about it, but unfortunately, when you, like everything in India, once you take the denominator into account, it doesn't seem so much. So it may be 1.5 million hours, and that sounds impressive, but we are 700,000 people. So it's about 2 hours per capita per year, which is, if you ask me, not very much. So it's the 8th largest corporate volunteering program in the world in the number of hours. But in hours per year per capita, it's not so strong. And we plan to double it to make it 4 over the next 5 years. So that is volunteering. That is putting our most valuable resource, which is our own people, into working for social good, societal good, and so on. And so these are broadly the community facing responsibilities, what we call corporate social responsibility as a whole, not the CSR as per the narrow Indian understanding. And the final thing that comes to me is also something called business and human rights, which is a much more operational issue in terms of that it's how companies make their money. It's not just how companies use their money or their personnel's time in their spare time. It's how they actually do their operations, how they acquire land, how their supply chains work, how they HR, how they recruit, and so on, which is business and human rights. That are we trampling on somebody's rights, any stakeholders' rights in the process of our operations? And this is a very difficult thing because it is in mainstream operations. Just to give you an example, it covers, that within our plants, we are reasonably confident that we are not violating, that we are paying women the same as men for the same work, for example, and that we don't have any child labor, and that everyone is getting, over and above, over the statutory minimum wage rate. In our own complexes, within our walls, we can say with certainty. But in our supply chains, in our first tier supply chains, maybe not. Well, I can say the first tier 1, the people who supply us directly, again with great confidence. Tier 2, the people who supply those who supply us, a little less confidence. Tier 5, what violations are happening, very difficult to know. We are trying to get visibility on that, but it's very difficult. It's a very different ball game. So this is also something that comes into me. And therefore, you see from my description, you would have noted that there's no real connection between my work and this thing called philanthropy at all. And therefore, this confusion as to why I've been asked to speak about philanthropy when I don't really have a role in it. Certainly, there's only one commonality that I can see, and that is that some of my work, that is the CSR component, the 2% of profit before tax, is involves making grants to NGOs, and philanthropy also involves for many understandings, making grants to NGOs. And therefore, I thought that maybe I could focus on this aspect. I hope that's okay, Amir. So I'll talk about philanthropy a little first.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then about CSR as per the 2%, and we'll skip all this stuff about volunteering, disaster response, business, and human rights, and so on. Let's just talk about CSR and philanthropy per se. Are there any questions or clarifications required at this point before I move on?
Not yet.
Yeah. I just
yeah.
No, I just wanted. I mean, curious to know whether it's. Although you have huge CSR and other things that you talked about, voluntary thing, but maybe I don't know whether you can touch upon, because Tata himself contributes a lot of things, like Ratan Tata or somebody. So are you trying to at least have a glimpse of what directions they go, and is there any specific guidance that you can figure out? Not that every time they do different things, but is there any commonality that you can find apart from design and other things? It's only a curiosity. It's not necessarily you should address, but because what I have seen in the past about philanthropies is they're very specific, whether it is from the foundations globally or at the national level. So a kind of direction, if you can provide, that would be excellent.
Yeah, I'll try to. But first, a clarification. I have no clue what Mr. Tata does with his money. Mr. R.N. Tata, I'm assuming. No clue at all. I don't want to know also. And I have a better idea of what the Tata Trusts does, which is our Maliks, in the Tata Group, what they do. A better idea, but I don't have any influence over it at all. And they also don't have any influence over what the companies do with their CSR funds. And we like it that way. We like the separation and so on. So, but I will try to touch upon philanthropy and so on. And so let me go on from here. Thank you, Anirban, for that clarification.
Murli. That was Murli.
Oh, that was Murli. I'm so sorry. Yeah. So I remember talking about a talk about philanthropy, and I'm talking in 2007. I had attended a workshop in the Association of Charitable Foundations in the UK. It was a meeting, sorry, not a workshop. And at that time, The Economist, the magazine, had brought out a special issue about philanthropy, about new philanthropy. And the editor of The Economist, he was the one who spoke at that conference, and he spoke about something called What's New About New Philanthropy. This is 2007. The editor was a guy called Matthew Bishop at that time. And this is September 2007 in London. And I took notes, and that's why I can tell you with reasonable clarity. And it's not my great memory. It's because I took notes on this that 2007 was an interesting time for philanthropy. I mean, Amir would know this firsthand because he was also part of the philanthropic movement, but it was a time when, of course, Gates had already put in his 30 billion into Gates Foundation, which Amir was part of that movement. And I think 2005, or just 2006, I think Warren Buffett had put in the additional $37 billion into that. So this thing of philanthropy was very much in the news at that time, in those days. And I'm talking 2007. And there was a scramble among the billionaires of that time. I think there were about 700 billionaires at that time, dollar billionaires, of course. And there was a scramble among them to be, other than buying submarines to go along with their ocean-going yachts, and purchasing football teams in the UK and various other places. The scramble also to be seen as philanthropists. And what Matthew Bishop said was that to understand new philanthropy, you have to understand new philanthropists. And the first thing about new philanthropy, there are certain characteristics that they have. One is most of them are self-made. The old philanthropists are all the guys who inherited their money and that sort of stuff. But most of the new philanthropists in 2007, they were self-made, highly successful people and highly arrogant people also, highly confident, highly arrogant about what they were doing and so on. And they had a scale of ambition for their philanthropic initiatives that matched that of their business initiatives. Okay. So they wanted to do things that had global impact. And they were completely, at the time, uninterested in approaches that did not have a potential to scale up. They wanted to transfer their attitudes on business to philanthropy. Most of them, not all of them, most of them. And I'll talk about some attitudes that did not transfer, but most of them transfer their attitudes of business to philanthropy. The other interesting thing about them was that they didn't think that they had much money. And therefore, they saw themselves more as innovators and as people who would try to use their efforts to leverage resources from governments and multinational corporations and so on. So they didn't think of themselves as much money. They realized the scale of the problem, that societal problems require a much greater scale than what the resources that they had. And they would need to build partnerships and leverage and that sort of stuff around it. They were also interested in for-profit ways of addressing social problems. And they were interested in that possibility also because it had the ability to attract resources to the problems that they were looking to solve, which were usually money, brains, and talent, and financial resources, and so on towards these problems. They did see the need to build quality organizations around the problems that they were looking to address. Am I still audible? Everyone is hearing me, I hope. Yeah, great. So they did see the need to build quality organizations. They did not see the need to stint on that and around the problems that they wanted to address. They understood the requirement for a long-term perspective, and they preferred to build their organizations from scratch, from bottom up. And this is unlike, because most of them built their money via acquisitions and so on. But in terms of their philanthropic initiatives, they said that we would rather build from scratch, build up these organizations from scratch. Again, Buffett was an exception. He decided to give his money to the Gates Foundation. And the other thing was that most of them looked down on what they called old philanthropy, which they saw more as, this is all about making grants rather than solving problems or addressing problems. And they were determined not to go down that road. So I remember just after that I went to Jaipur and Rajasthan, and we were talking. I was working with Paul Hamlin Foundation at that time, which was also a charitable. He was also a philanthropist. He had passed away, of course, by then, but it was his money that was being used. And we were talking about universalizing primary education and looking at slow, gradual, incremental approaches. And Airtel Foundation, which was very much on the new thinking, they came along and said that, just tell us how many schools need to be run and we'll take it over. We just need the land for the schools from the government, and we'll do everything except the government has to deal with the teachers' unions. Other than that, we'll do everything. This I'm talking 2007 again. And the confidence that they had about just let's go and address the problem was amazing. I don't think they have addressed the problem. Of course, this is the advantage of hindsight, which is always, as we all know, 2020. But I don't think they have addressed the problem. But the way that they talked about it, that, we'll throw money at it. This is the problem. This is the solution. Let's go and do something about it. And it requires money. We have the money. We're talking scale. You're talking 100, 200 schools. That's fine. No problem. The more schools, the better. And that's how they were. And it was amazing. It was refreshing. It was so enlightening to see that approach. I look at the opposite, which is old philanthropy, which I had more association with. And Amir had already brought this point up that, they didn't look at the problem per se. They looked at building civil society as a whole and building organizations for building that would contribute to a betterment of civil society as a whole and so on. And grant making, as I've already pointed out, and that sort of thing. And that many of the good organizations of today, at a critical time in their evolution, they were funded by the Tata Trust or some such organization which was philanthropic in nature and did not say that what problem are you looking to address? Rather, what you need to build a good organization which will address the problems that you look to see. So that was a very different way of um, how old philanthropy differed from um, from the thinking of that time in 2007 about this, what this new philanthropy was. One sees as time has passed that uh, between old philanthropy and new philanthropy, there have been some confluence and some commonalities have emerged and so on in this time. And one is that old philanthropy has also started looking at problems and less about, what do you need for an NGO to develop or a good organization to develop, and more about what is the problem that you're looking to address and so on. And I think there's been a lot of movement in this time between, earlier grant making to let's do something about the problem ourselves, get the people that put in place and start doing something about it, and then back to grant making. So it seems to be a never-ending circle. And the moment you go into grant making, you see the virtues of doing something about it yourself rather than making grants to assorted third parties. And the moment you start having to manage large numbers of people within your own systems and the salaries and the HR issues and that sort of stuff and the admin costs and so on, you start seeing the virtue of just handing out money to some third party and letting, getting it off your head and running a slightly lean, mean office yourself and letting other people outsource the actual work and so on. So this is a constant movement. I think Tata Trust has moved from grant making to doing something themselves, and I don't know what state they're in at this time. I mean, there's a constant state of flux that I see there. But again, as I said, I don't know. I'm not from Tata Trust. I'm not an insider or anything like that. I just see it from the outside.